Well, hey, welcome back to another week of my updates. I wanted to do another book review today with you. This is a interesting subject to talk about, is the violence that happened in the 1800s. So the book that I read to help out with this is this book called The Turbulent Era. This is a really great book, understanding the 1830s, 40s, and 50s, and what happened during Jackson's time as president, basically. So it's called the Jacksonian era, basically. It's not a big book, as you can tell. Uh, I bought this book off of Amazon, so apparently it was part of a library collection at one point. But it's really interesting to look at this idea of how violent the 1800s were. I mean, we think, when we look at it from our perspective back on the 1800s, we look at them and just think, man, what a crazy time. It's violent. There's lots of death and destruction and things like that. Um, you know, eh, eh, Based on our time, 1800s were completely lawless and wild. Even the movies, when we think of the ideas of the old John Wayne movies and the westerns and things where cities rally together and they fight against the big conglomerates that are trying to come in and steal their wealth out from underneath them and things like that. That happened. Like that's not an uncommon thing for the 1800s to look at. Is people took the law in their own hands. So early 1800s, the United States didn't really believe in a standing army. So most of the army was a volunteer effort. In a lot of places, counties were allowed to develop their own militias. So when you think of like Second Amendment type ideas, they didn't want necessarily a standing army. They wanted the people to be the army, to have volunteers. So counties would form militias, and they would go out and act as these independent militias. The court system wasn't super developed at the time. We didn't really have a lot of police like we have today, where there's a sheriff or a police chief and a whole bunch of police officers. They didn't have that like that. There's oftentimes like a person who's a sheriff, maybe they have a deputy, and then they would rally people together to form a posse, to form a militia, and then go out and to exact justice against the bad guys. So it was very loose, and everybody had somewhat of a say and responsibility in this. Well, this book talks about some of those experiences in here. There were some really interesting ones. Uh, One of the ones in the book that was in Philadelphia, in fact, there was a big riot that happened over there. There were a lot of problems with anti-Catholic challenges. So as Protestantism grew in America and became the more predominant religion, Catholicism was seen as a bad deal, bad thing. So there were riots that started up. In fact, there was a law that was passed in the 1800s that said that schools should teach the Bible, and they're going to use the King James Version for that Bible, the official Bible for school teaching. Well, the Catholics at the time were using a different Bible. And so they said, we want to be able to use our own Bible for Catholic students. And the government said, no, you got to use the Protestant Bible. And they says, well, then we just won't teach religion in schools, basically, because we see that as you imposing Protestantism onto Catholic students. And so a bit of a uproar happened because of this, which ended up becoming a riot. People protested. Other groups came out to protest the protesters, and it turned into a big fight that killed several people and caused a lot of property damage. So when we look at the riots, even during 2020, that's what the 1800s was like, basically, according to this book. There were some crazy riots that happened. So this is not an uncommon thing. Even when you look at like LDS church history, the LDS church has a definite history of militias forming, mobs coming against them to kill people, to take them out of their cities, to burn houses down, destroy the press. Lots of things like that were happening, and it was common. It wasn't. We look at it and think, "Oh, that's so crazy that they formed a mob and went after the Mormons," but it happened to the Catholics. It happened to the Irish, half because they were Catholic. It happened to other minorities where these groups would just form up. People would get a collective mentality, and then they'd form a militia and go fight the other groups. um, so this idea of justice, was uh, uh, somewhat relative. Like if we believed that there was a person that was being bad and it would be justified, we would be justified in pulling together. If we believed that we were righteous and they were the evil ones, then we would be justified in pulling a militia together to go fight them. And that was common. That's how it happened. It was really interesting that how prevalent that really was. So if you want to read an interesting book, it's not very long. You can probably find it in a local library too if you don't want to buy it on Amazon. But The Turbulent Era. It's a really great book looking at violence in the 1800s. Now, to kind of go along with this, I want to talk about I'm going to do a series later this summer on a topic of LDS violence that is really absolutely fascinating to study. And that goes along with this book. So if you're not familiar with the Mountain Meadows Massacre, this is a probably the worst thing to happen in LDS history is the Mountain Meadows Massacre. A bunch of immigrants from the South were killed by a conglomeration of Mormon settlers and Indians down in Mountain Meadows, which is about 40 miles west of Cedar City. If you know where Snow Canyon is, if you go about 20 minutes north of the Snow Canyon Park, that's where Mountain Meadows was at the top of that canyon, basically. So this book here is by Juanita Brooks. She wrote this in the 1970s. I believe she is LDS. This was kind of the first major scholarly research into the Mountain Meadows Massacre from LDS people. There was other research, there were other reports, other things that were done for a long time before. Mountain Meadows Massacre happened on September 11th, 1857. So it's just a little bit past this turbulent era time frame here, but it's pretty close, basically. As far as like the logic that people used in here was used to allow this to happen. So I'm going to talk about this. This is one of 3 books of research that I'm going through right now to study the Mountain Meadows Massacre and to understand it better. It's an absolutely fascinating piece of LDS history to study, and understanding even just American history in the 1800s. If you want to understand how crazy it was, you've got to look at some of these specific examples. And for the West, the Mountain Meadows Massacre was a very key one in American history in the 1800s. So I'm going to do a couple of videos about this massacre, what happened, why did it happen, what precipitated it happening, what were some of the fallout from the massacre,